The cell is small, whitewashed, and nearly bare. A plank bed, a crucifix, a single high window letting in the flat gold light of a Castilian afternoon. Teresa is at prayer, as she is most afternoons of her life by now, kneeling with the particular attention of a woman who has learned, slowly and at great cost, how to be still. And then the air beside her changes. She sees him at her left side, not looming, not vast, small, in bodily form. The kind of angel she will later say she rarely saw with the eyes of the body at all. But this one she sees. He is fire from within, a face so aflame with light that she understands him at once for one of the highest order, the kind called seraphim, though he does not tell her his rank and she does not think to ask. In his hands is a long spear of gold, and at its tip, where an ordinary spear would carry iron, there is a point of fire. He plunges it into her heart, not once, again and again, and each time he draws it back, it seems to draw her very entrails with it, so that when he leaves her, she is left hollowed and burning at once, and utterly consumed with the love of God. The pain, she will say afterward, is so sharp that it forces a moan from her. And there is no dishonesty in the moan, no performance of suffering for an audience of one visitor, because there is no one else in the room to see it. But the pain is so surpassing sweet that she cannot wish it to stop. She will write, in the plain, unadorned hand she uses for the most tremendous things, that the soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God, and that the pain is not of the body at all, though the body suffers with it, but a pain so delicate it defies her to find words. Some moaning of the body does escape, small and involuntary, and she will feel almost embarrassed about it later, in the way she is embarrassed about any attention drawn to herself. But in the moment there is no room in her for embarrassment. There is only the fire, and the gold, and the going in and coming out of the dart, and the sense, utterly certain, needing no argument, that God himself has reached down and done this to her on purpose, and would do it again tomorrow if he chose, and she would not lift a hand to stop him. This is the transverberation. The word itself is borrowed from Latin, meaning to pierce through, and the theologians will use it for centuries afterward, to name this one grace among the hundreds Teresa received in prayer. Not because it is the strangest of her mystical experiences, and it is not even close to the strangest, but because it is the one she describes with such precision, such restrained and startling clarity, that it becomes impossible for anyone who reads her account to look away. Almost 100 years after her death, a sculptor in Rome will read that same account and be unable to look away either. Gian Lorenzo Bernini was given the Cornaro Chapel in Santa Maria della Vittoria in the 1640s and told, in effect, to make marble do what Teresa's words had done to him on the page. He did not carve a saint standing serenely with a symbol in her hand, the way earlier art so often rendered its holy women, composed, upright, safely at a remove from the viewer. He carved a woman falling. Her body goes slack in the moment of the wound, her head thrown back, her mouth open, one bare foot dangling loose from the folds of her habit, as if she has forgotten she has a body at all. Above her, the angel is not solemn either. He is smiling, a soft, almost mischievous smile, the smile of someone who knows exactly what he is about to do and takes a kind of delight in it, and he holds the golden arrow lightly, almost teasingly, poised at the height of her breast. Light pours down on the two of them from a hidden window Bernini built into the chapel's ceiling for this exact purpose, gilded rays falling like solid rain, so that the marble seems less carved than caught in the instant between the entrance of the fire and the cry. Visitors have stood in front of that chapel for nearly 400 years now, and the question that unsettles almost all of them, whether they come as pilgrims or as tourists with a guidebook open to the wrong page, is the same question. Is this ecstasy or is this agony? Bernini, wisely, refuses to answer it because Teresa herself refused to answer it. She lived the distinction between those two words as a distinction the body cannot always keep, not when the wound comes from a love large enough to overwhelm it. The moan and the rapture come out of the same throat. It would be easy, meeting Teresa first through Bernini's marble, or through the astonishment of her own description, to mistake this for the whole of her, to imagine a woman who spent her days swooning, borne up on visions, a soul so saturated with the miraculous that ordinary life could barely touch her. Nothing could be further from the truth of who she was, and nothing would have annoyed Teresa more. She was, by the time this grace came to her, already deep into middle age, already a woman who kept convent account books in her own hand, negotiated with bishops and landlords, argued gently and then not so gently with her confessors, and rode mule carts down bad roads in weather no sensible person would choose. The dart of fire did not lift her out of that life. It drove her further into it. Within a few years of receiving this grace most fully, she would leave her convent's walls, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, to begin founding new houses of prayer across Spain, 16 of them before she died, in conditions of poverty and opposition that would have exhausted a far younger and far less burned woman. The fire did not make her decorative, it made her dangerous. In the particular way that love always makes people dangerous to complacency, their own and everyone else's. She herself was wary of anyone who wanted to talk too much about it. Later in her life, when word of the experience had begun to travel, first through her confessors, who required her under obedience to write down everything that happened to her in prayer, then more widely through the manuscript of her own account of her soul, the book we call her life, she would grow uneasy at the attention. Visions and raptures, she insisted again and again to the young nuns she was forming in her own reformed houses, are not the measure of holiness. She had seen too many well-meaning souls chase the extraordinary and neglect the ordinary. Too many confessors made anxious by phenomena they did not understand. Too many women in her own convents grow more concerned with what happened to them in prayer than with growing more humble, more patient, more genuinely loving of the sisters they lived beside. What God wants, she would tell them plainly, is not raptures but obedient love, worked out in 100 small unglamorous acts a day, nursing a sick sister, sweeping a floor, holding one's tongue. She meant this. Whatever we come to understand of Teresa in the pages ahead, we should hold that conviction of hers close, because she held it closer than almost anything else she ever taught. The mystical is real, and it matters enormously, but it is never the point. God is the point. The dart of fire was never given to her as a spectacle. It was given as an act of love between two who already, by then, knew each other very well. And that more than the flame or the gold or the smiling angel is what deserves our attention as we begin. Not the wonder of the grace, but the intimacy behind it. A wound like that is not inflicted on a stranger. It presupposes a friendship already years deep. A soul that has spent decades learning, clumsily, through failure and dryness and long years of what she would later call a kind of half-hearted, distracted prayer she was ashamed of, how to sit still in the presence of someone who loved her without reservation. The transverberation was not the beginning of Teresa's story. It was closer to a culmination, a visible flare in a fire that had been banked and building for a very long time, since a girl in a walled Castilian city first tried, with her brother, to run off toward martyrdom among the Moors, because she had heard that martyrs went straight to see the face of God and could not bear to wait. We will meet that girl soon enough, her convent school years, her illness, her long and honestly reluctant road into religious life, the 18 years of what she frankly called a poorly lived, half-committed prayer life, before something in her broke open, before a statue of the wounded Christ, and she gave herself over completely. We will meet the Teresa who founded convents on borrowed money and prayed the roof would hold through the first winter. The Teresa who joked, when her cart overturned into a river on the way to a new foundation, that if this was how God treated his friends, it was no wonder he had so few of them. The Teresa who argued with bishops, outwitted a hostile provincial, and wrote one of the great books of Christian mysticism, The Interior Castle, in the space of a few months near the end of her life, almost as an afterthought to everything else she was doing. All of that lies ahead in these pages, and none of it should be rushed past, because it is in the ordinary friction of that life, the accounts to balance, the sisters to console, the endless roads, that we come to understand what the fire actually did to her. But it seemed right, before any of that, to begin here, in the small cell, in the gold light, with the angel and the flame, and the cry that was somehow both a complaint and a kind of praise. Because this is the astonishment that ought to sit underneath everything else we learn about Teresa of Avila, the fact that should keep quietly humming beneath every chapter of her long, busy, complicated life. She was a woman loved by God almost past what a human body could hold. Not admired from a distance, not merely obedient to a set of commandments, not simply devout in the ordinary sense that word usually carries, pierced, sought out, wanted, with a particularity and a violence of tenderness that left a wound she carried, by her own account for the rest of her days, one whose ache she would sometimes still feel even years later, long after the visions themselves had grown less frequent. She never fully explained why it should have been her. She would have been the first to say she did not deserve it, and she meant that too, not as false modesty but as plain accounting, the way she kept the books of her convents in plain, exact figures. She had been, by her own unsparing account, a vain young woman once, fond of perfume and pretty conversation, slow and half-hearted in prayer for years after entering the convent, distracted by visitors and small vanities long after she ought to have known better. None of that made her ineligible for the fire. If anything, her honesty about all of it is part of why the fire is believable at all, because grace, in Teresa's own telling, never waits for us to become impressive before it comes looking. It comes looking for whoever will finally sit still long enough to be found. That, in the end, is the invitation folded inside the marble and inside her own trembling handwritten account of what happened to her that afternoon. Not an invitation to imitate ecstasy, which cannot be imitated and was never meant to be sought for its own sake. An invitation to imagine, just for a moment, what it might mean to be wanted like that, to be pursued by a love patient enough to wait through 18 distracted years and fierce enough, when the waiting was over, to come with fire in its hands. Teresa spent the rest of her life trying to help other souls believe such a love was possible for them too, ordinary as they were, and never once suggested it required the golden dart. It required only the willingness to be still long enough and honest enough to let herself, and eventually us, be found. Avila sits on a granite shelf in the middle of Castile, ringed by walls so complete and so upright that from a distance the city looks less like a place people live than like a crown someone set down and forgot to pick up. 88 towers, nearly 2 miles of stone, thick enough to walk along the top of, raised in the 12th century against the Moors, and never quite trusted to have finished their work. Winters there come off the Sierra de Gredos like a judgment. The wind does not visit Avila so much as occupy it, and within those walls, in the year 1515, in a house on what is now the Calle de la Dicha, the Street of Good Fortune, though nobody could have known that then, Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada was born into a family that had a great deal to prove, and a granddaughter who would end up proving it in a way none of them could have imagined. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a wool merchant, grown wealthy enough to purchase the trappings of nobility, which in 16th century Spain meant something specific and something fragile. Alonso's own father had been forced, decades before, to walk through Toledo in a humiliating public reconciliation ordered by the Inquisition, a reconciliación exposing the family's converso blood, its descent from Jews converted to Christianity, a lineage that in the blood-obsessed society of the day could be spoken of only in whispers, if at all. Alonso built a life in Avila that erased the whisper as far as any life could. He married well, twice, his first wife dying young, and among the children of his second marriage, to Beatriz de Ahumada, was a dark-eyed, quick-tongued girl who from her earliest years watched her father with the particular attention children reserve for the parent they mean to become. What Teresa loved best about her father's house was his library. This alone tells you something about the kind of household Avila's minor nobility could keep in the early 16th century, and something more particular about Alonso, a man careful enough of his daughters' souls that he preferred them reading saints' lives to reading nothing at all, and unable, in the end, to keep the line between the two kinds of reading from blurring in his own house. Books of chivalry had swept across Spain in Teresa's childhood, the way certain novels sweep across any age. Tales of knights and enchantments, of Amadis de Gaula and his endless combats, stories with no more moral weight than the paper they were printed on, and utterly irresistible to a girl with Teresa's imagination. She read them by candlelight with her brother Rodrigo, the two of them so drunk on adventure that Teresa, by her own account years later, tried her hand at writing a chivalric romance of her own, a detail she offers in her autobiography with the same rueful affection she brings to most of her youthful follies, neither excusing it nor pretending it was nothing. It would be easy, and wrong, to treat this as merely a charming anecdote to get through before the real story starts. The girl who lost herself in tales of impossible courage and impossible love was not practicing for sainthood by way of some other lesser art. She was already showing the shape her soul would keep for the rest of her life. Teresa was never a person who did things by half measures. Whatever caught her, a story, a friendship, a fear, eventually a bridegroom, caught the whole of her, and she went after it with an intensity that unsettled people who preferred their women, and for that matter their nuns, more contained. The books of chivalry did not create that intensity. They gave it its first outlet. Which brings us to the Moors, and to one of the most beloved stories in the entire life of this saint, a story every Carmelite has heard 100 times and never tires of hearing again, because it is so entirely, recognizably her. Teresa was perhaps 7 years old. Her brother Rodrigo was a few years older. Between them, they had absorbed not only the chivalric romances, but also, and more dangerously for their own safety, the lives of the martyrs, stories of Christians in the early centuries of the Church, who had gone to their deaths under torture rather than deny Christ, and who were rewarded, so the children reasoned, by walking straight into the presence of God without any of the tedious intervening decades of ordinary life. Heaven, to the child Teresa, was not an abstraction to be earned through patient virtue. It was a country you could enter immediately, gloriously, if only you were willing to die for it. And dying for it seemed, to a 7-year-old with an older brother and an appetite for adventure, entirely achievable. The plan the two children hatched was to travel to the land of the Moors, Islamic territory, still close enough to Castile in memory, and in fact to be a real and present idea to a child in Avila, and there to be beheaded for the faith. They would go together. They packed nothing we know of but their resolve, and slipped out of the house, and made it as far as the Adagio River at the edge of the city, over the bridge, on the road out toward whatever glory awaited two small Sapitas among the infidels, before an uncle spotted them and marched them straight back home to their mother. Teresa tells this story on herself in the life with a mixture of tenderness and amusement that should tell the reader everything about how she wanted this whole period of her childhood understood. She is not holding the episode up as evidence of early sanctity, a saint already straining at the leash of the ordinary world. She tells it because it was true, and because it was funny, and because, under the humor, it reveals something she considered far more important than any childish escapade. That she had, from the very beginning, wanted God with an appetite too large for half measures. The theology was almost comically wrong. The 7-year-old had no clear idea what waded across that river, no understanding of what martyrdom actually cost the men and women who endured it, no grasp of doctrine sufficient to distinguish glory from folly. But the wanting was not wrong at all. It was the truest thing about her, showing itself far too early and in far too small a body to be safely acted upon. And her mother's household caught it before it could do any harm beyond a scolding and a very long walk home in the Castilian sun. When the martyrdom plan failed, brother and sister did not simply give it up. They turned, with the same energy, to building hermitages instead, piling stones in the garden to make little cells where they could go and, in their own words, be hermits, imitating the desert fathers whose stories filled the same shelves as the saints' lives and the chivalric romances. The stones kept falling down. Teresa remembered this too, with the same fondness. Not that the hermitage building succeeded, but that the impulse behind it was never in question. She wanted, even as a small girl playing at piety with her brother in a walled garden in Avila, to give herself entirely to something larger than the ordinary run of days. She did not yet know what that something was called, or what it would eventually ask of her. She only knew she wanted it more than she wanted anything else the games of childhood could offer. This is worth sitting with, because it corrects an idea about Teresa that persists long after people have finished admiring her. That her holiness descended on her, as it were, from outside, a conversion imposed on a worldly young woman, by some sudden and overwhelming grace, transforming her, against her own grain, into a saint. Nothing in the record supports reading her childhood that way. The appetite for God was there from the beginning, present in the same person who loved chivalric romance, present in the same person who would grow into a young woman fond of fine clothes and clever conversation, and the attention of the young men who came calling at her father's house. Teresa did not become holy by suppressing the girl who ran for the river with her brother. She became holy by that girl's own energy, redirected, deepened, matured, and finally given its true object. The Carmelite tradition has never wanted to lose sight of this. It is the whole reason her life comforts rather than merely impresses. The saint was, all along, unmistakably herself. Her mother, Beatrice de Ahumada, is a figure who appears only briefly in Teresa's own writing, and yet every appearance carries weight beyond its length. Beatrice married Alonso as his second wife when she herself was barely more than a child, not yet 15, and bore him a great number of children in the years that followed, before dying still young herself, worn down, by every account we have, by the sheer physical toll of repeated childbearing in an age with little mercy for a mother's body. Teresa was 13 when her mother died in 1528, and the loss struck her with a force she describes plainly in the life. She went, she tells us, before an image of Our Lady and begged the Blessed Virgin to be her mother, now that her own mother was gone. It is one of the most tender and revealing moments Teresa gives us from her own childhood, offered without any of the wry self-deprecation she brings to the Moor story or the Hermitage stones. There was no humor in this grief. There was only a girl who had lost the person who anchored her, turning instinctively toward the one mother who could never be taken from her, and finding, as she would find again and again across the rest of her life, in griefs far larger than this one, that the turn toward heaven was not an escape from love, but its continuation. Beatrice had loved the chivalric romances too, by Teresa's own account, and had allowed her children more license with them than a stricter mother might have. It is tempting to wonder whether some of Teresa's mother lived on in her daughter's later gift for narrative, for the vivid, plain-spoken, image-rich Castilian prose that would one day carry the whole weight of the interior castle. We cannot know this for certain, and the Carmelite tradition does not claim to. But it is not nothing that the girl who lost her mother at 13 would grow up to be, among everything else she became, one of the great prose stylists of the Spanish language, a woman who wrote as she spoke, urgently, warmly, without affectation, exactly the way a daughter of Beatrice de Ahumada might have learned to speak at her mother's knee before that knee was taken from her. With Beatrice gone, the household lost whatever gentleness had tempered Alonso's more careful, more anxious governance of his children, and the years that followed brought out a different Teresa than the one who had run for the river or piled stones in the garden. She was, by her own unsparing later account, a girl acutely aware of her own attractiveness, drawn to fine clothing and perfume and the arts of pleasing that a well-born young woman of Avila was expected to master, and drawn as well to the company of a cousin whose influence her father judged, rightly or wrongly, to be dangerous to her reputation and her soul. Teresa does not spare herself in describing this period of her adolescence. She calls her own vanity and her own attachments by their names, offers no excuse for them, and yet never writes about this stretch of her life as though it were a stain to be scrubbed out of the record before the real story of the saint could begin. It is part of the same story. It is the same girl. Alonso, worried enough about his daughter's company and her reputation, made the decision that so many anxious fathers of the era made with their spirited daughters. He sent her away to be educated by nuns. In 1531, at 16, Teresa entered the Augustinian convent of Our Lady of Grace in Avila, not as a novice bound for religious life, but as a boarder, a young woman being finished, in the old sense of that word, taught, supervised, kept at a careful distance from whatever had alarmed her father at home. She went, by her own admission, without any great enthusiasm for the arrangement. She liked the world. She liked being looked at and being clever and being admired, and a convent full of quiet, prayerful women was not, at 16, where she imagined her life heading. And yet it was there, watching one particular nun, a woman named Maria de Briceño, whose patience and evident peace worked on Teresa slowly, almost against her own resistance, that something in her began, for the first time since childhood, to turn back toward God with more than a game's intensity. She grew, over the 18 months of her stay, genuinely fond of convent life, genuinely drawn to the idea that the peace she saw in these women might be more durable, more real, than anything the world outside those walls had offered her. She left Our Lady of Grace, when illness forced her home, no longer entirely the girl who had entered it. The appetite that had sent a 7-year-old running for the river with her brother had never gone away. It had simply been waiting, through the vanity and the fine clothes and the anxious watchfulness of her father's house, for something worth all of itself again. She was not there yet. The decision to enter religious life fully, and the anguish that decision cost her, the tearing she describes as being like the moment of death itself, belongs to the chapter after this one. What belongs here, in these walled streets, in this book-lined house, in this garden of collapsing hermit stones, is the plain fact of who she already was before any of it. A girl of enormous appetite and enormous honesty about that appetite, who wanted heaven the way other children want sweets, who grieved her mother without pretending otherwise, who loved the world's beauty without pretending she didn't, and who would spend the whole of the rest of her life discovering that God had made her exactly this large on purpose. Avila's walls kept the Moors out for 3 centuries. They could not, in the end, keep a girl like this one contained inside the small ambitions her century had ready for her. She was built for something greater, and the building had already begun, stone by uneven stone, long before she ever wore a habit. The morning she left home for good, Teresa did not stop to say goodbye. It was the 2nd of November, 1535, the Feast of All Souls, and Avila was still dark when she and her brother Antonio slipped out through the streets toward the Monastery of the Incarnation, just outside the city walls. She was 20 years old. Her father Alonso had refused for months to give his consent. He loved her too much, and grief for her mother was still too near to let her go easily into a cloister. So Teresa went without it. She would say afterward that the pain of that walk nearly broke her in two, that she loved her father so much, the wrench of leaving him felt like death itself, and that she did it anyway, because she had already decided, with the same iron will she'd shown at 7 plotting to be martyred among the Moors, that this, not marriage, not the pleasant half-measures of a devout laywoman, was where her life belonged. Alonso, when he understood she meant it, gave way. Within the year he came himself to see her clothed in the habit. The Incarnation was not a small or a poor house. Some 180 women lived there when Teresa arrived, daughters of Avila's best families, many with their own servants, their own furnished rooms, their own small comforts brought from home. The primitive rule that Carmel had once kept, the silence, the poverty, the enclosure, had long since relaxed into something gentler and far more sociable. Nuns received visitors in a long parlor, divided by a grill, sometimes for hours, sometimes daily. Teresa, charming and quick-tongued as she had always been, took to the parlor easily. She was, by every account, wonderful company, the kind of woman other people wanted near them, family included, and her family came often. None of this was scandalous by the standards of the house. It was simply how the Incarnation lived. But it meant that Teresa entered religious life inside a community where the raw, demanding intimacy with God she had glimpsed as a child reading the Desert Fathers would have to be sought out, guarded, and defended against 100 gentle daily distractions, and for a long stretch of years she did not defend it well. That struggle was still ahead of her. First came the illness that nearly ended everything. It began not long after her profession in November of 1537, a wasting sickness that no one in Avila could name or treat. Fevers, fainting, a heart that seemed to seize and flutter without warning. Her father, desperate, arranged for her to be taken to Besides, a village some leagues away, where a woman with a local reputation was known for curing what physicians could not. The cure very nearly killed her. Whatever remedies Teresa endured at Besides left her far worse than she had come, and by the time she was brought back to Avila in the summer of 1539, she was, by her own description, scarcely more than a body in pain, barely conscious, racked, unable to keep down food or find rest in any position. Then, near Easter of that year, she collapsed into something that looked, to everyone standing over her, exactly like death. For 4 days, Teresa lay without any sign of life that the women around her could detect. No pulse they could find, no breath they could be certain of. Wax was dripped on her eyelids, in the custom of the time, to test whether any reflex of life remained. There was none. A grave was dug for her at the Incarnation, and the nuns began, in genuine grief, to prepare for her burial. It was her father who would not allow it. Something in him, call it a father's stubborn love, or something further, refused to accept the verdict everyone else had already made. He insisted she still lived, and delayed the burial against the urging of those around him. He was right. Teresa woke. What she woke to was not health. The 4 days had left her body so ravaged that she could not move on her own for the better part of 3 years afterward. able, at her strongest, only to crawl short distances on her hands and knees. This was not a brief convalescence with a clear end in sight. It was years of a young woman in her 20s, a woman who had entered religion burning to give her whole self to God in some dramatic and costly way, reduced instead to being carried, to being dressed and fed and turned in her bed by other people's hands, with no physician in Castile able to tell her whether she would ever walk again. She turned, in that helplessness, to Saint Joseph. It became one of the most tender and enduring facts of her whole life, this turn to the quiet foster father of Christ, a saint who at the time had nowhere near the devotion he enjoys today. Teresa asked him, with the simple directness she brought to every relationship she ever had with a friend in heaven, to obtain for her the use of her limbs. She would later say she never asked him anything in her life that he did not obtain for her, that of all the saints none had failed her, and that she wished she could persuade the whole world of his power to intercede, since she had proved it so thoroughly in her own body. Gradually, unevenly, over months that must have felt endless to a woman who had once run wild and fearless across the Avila countryside plotting martyrdom, she recovered the ability to walk. It was never a swift miracle, no single dramatic morning when she rose from her bed entire. It was slow mending, prayer laid over prayer, and at the end of it, a debt to Saint Joseph she would carry and repay for the rest of her life. Years later, when she came to found her first Reformed convent, there was no question in her mind whose name it would bear. It would be a fine and simple story if Teresa's recovery of her body had come paired with an equal recovery of her soul's fervor. If the woman who had so nearly died had risen from that sickbed burning with the single-minded love of God that would one day set half of Spain on fire. That is not what happened, and Teresa never once pretended otherwise. What followed instead were years she herself, writing decades later in the book of her life, called wasted. Not sinful in any dramatic or scandalous sense, she never accuses herself in her autobiography of anything her Avila neighbors would have recognized as vice. She kept her vows. She was faithful, by any ordinary measure, to the duties of her state. But she confessed, with a bluntness that startles readers who expect saints to soften their own record, that for the better part of 18 or 20 years, she lived what she called a divided life. One foot given to God in mental prayer, the other still reaching after the small pleasures of conversation, affection, and the parlor's easy warmth. She wrote that she found it a kind of fickleness in herself, wanting friendship with God and yet unwilling to give up friendship with the world, as though the two could simply sit side by side without cost. For a long while she believed they could. She came, slowly and painfully, to see that they could not at the depth of prayer she had once glimpsed and wanted more of. The parlor was where this divided life did its quiet damage. It was not a place of scandal. It was a place of family visits, of news from Avila, of the small kindnesses and vanities that pass between people who are fond of one another. And Teresa, gifted with the kind of warmth that drew people to her without her even trying, was sought after there constantly. She had, by her own account, a real weakness for being liked. She loved to be loved, loved good conversation, loved the particular pleasure of being the one people wanted to talk to. None of it would have troubled an ordinary devout laywoman's conscience in the least. It troubled Teresa's, because she knew, she always knew, even in the years she failed to act on the knowledge, that she had entered the incarnation for something far past ordinary devotion. She had gone there to give herself entirely to mental prayer, to that wordless, searching intimacy with Christ she had first tasted as a girl. And she found, to her own honest dismay, that an hour in the parlor left her far less hungry for an hour before the Blessed Sacrament than she knew it should. There were stretches, more than a year at a time, by her own count, when she gave up mental prayer altogether. She did not dress this up in her later writing as a subtle spiritual trial or a dark night sent by God to purify her. She called it what it was, her own weakness, compounded by bad advice from confessors who did not understand what they were dealing with, and by her own conviction, false but deeply felt, that a soul as tepid and divided as hers had no business presuming to sit quietly with God as though she were some great contemplative. She thought, for long periods, that mental prayer was for people more serious than she was, people who had actually renounced the small comforts she could not bring herself to renounce. Better, she reasoned, to say her vocal prayers faithfully and leave the deeper conversation to holier women. It is one of the more startling admissions in all her writing, that the woman who would become the Church's great teacher of interior prayer spent years believing herself unworthy to attempt it, and simply stopped. She never once, in telling this part of her story later, reached for an excuse. She did not blame the Incarnation's relaxed customs, though she had plenty of grounds to. She did not blame her father's grief, or her own poor health, or the confessors who misjudged her case, though she named all of these honestly as contributing causes. What she insisted on, again and again in the life, was her own responsibility. She had known better. She had tasted, as a girl and in her early months at the Incarnation, what real prayer felt like, the sweetness of it, the sense of being genuinely met. And she had let that knowledge go slack out of nothing more dramatic than a fondness for comfort and company. It is a strange kind of courage to look back across 20 years of one's own religious life and call so much of it wasted without a single word of self-pity. Teresa managed it because by the time she wrote it down, she had already crossed into the fire on the other side and could afford the honesty. But even in the years while she was living it, something in her never fully surrendered. She kept returning, after every lapse, to try mental prayer again. She never abandoned it forever. She would later say that whatever good came afterward in her life, she owed entirely to the mercy of a God who did not let go of her even when she had, for a season, half let go of him. Her father Alonso died in 1543, and Teresa was at his side through the last days of his illness, guiding him, with real skill by every account, and real tenderness, into the kind of prayerful surrender to God's will that she herself was still struggling to sustain in her own soul. It is one of the small ironies she must have turned over many times in later years, that she could lead her own father gently toward God, even while feeling herself, in her private judgment, mediocre and divided. Grace, it seems, was already working in her hands, and her voice even during the very years she counted as failure. Nothing about this middle stretch of Teresa's life reads like collapse. She did not leave the Incarnation, did not abandon her vows, did not stop believing in the God she had promised herself to. What she lived through instead was something far more familiar to most people who have ever tried to pray seriously for more than a few weeks. The long, unglamorous drift of a soul that knows exactly what it wants and cannot seem to hold on to it, that keeps starting over, keeps falling back, keeps mistaking its own weakness for a settled verdict on its worth. Teresa lived inside that drift for the better part of 2 decades, in a body that had already been raised, quite literally, from what everyone around her had taken for death. She would look back on those years later with unsparing clarity and call them wasted. But she would also insist with equal clarity that God had never once been absent from them, that the ember she thought had gone out under all that ash had in fact been quietly kept alive the whole time, waiting for the day she would finally stop feeding it ashes and let it burn. The statue had not been made for the Incarnation. It came into the house on loan, brought in for some feast day observance, and left, as such things are sometimes left in a room the sisters passed through on their way to somewhere else, an oratory used for private devotion, dim even at midday, its window facing the wrong way for good light. The image was carved and painted in the Spanish manner that does not flinch. Christ bound to the pillar, scourged, the wounds rendered not as symbols but as wounds, the wood painted so that blood looked wet. The sisters called it, simply, the Cristo muy llagado, the Christ most wounded. It was not beautiful in the way a Florentine Madonna is beautiful. It was beautiful the way truth is beautiful, which is to say it did not ask to be admired, it asked to be looked at. Teresa was 39 years old when she found herself alone in that room, and she found herself, by her own account, undone. She had been 39 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. We have already walked the long middle years with her, the parlor days, the visits, the divided heart that could not choose between the world it had renounced by vow and the God it had renounced the world for. She had not stopped praying in all that time. That is important to hold on to, because it would be easy, hearing what came next, to imagine a woman who had simply given up and needed one dramatic jolt to start again. That is not what happened. What happened is harder, and to anyone who has ever tried to love God with a distracted heart, far more recognizable. She had kept at mental prayer for years the way a person keeps at a friendship gone stale, faithfully, guiltily, without much joy, telling herself that fidelity to the form was enough even when the substance had gone thin. She would say later that she found more taste in vocal prayer than in the silent kind, because silence left her nowhere to hide from herself. Some days she counted the minutes of the hour like a prisoner counts a sentence. She confessed without a trace of self-flattery, one of the worst persons she had ever known at persevering in mental prayer. And she meant every word of it, not because it was true in some absolute sense, but because that is how her own failures felt from the inside, magnified by a conscience that had grown severe with disappointment in itself. And then, one ordinary day in that unremarkable room, she looked up at the wounds. She had seen crucifixes before. She had seen this very kind of devotional image 100 times, the passion rendered in paint and wood for the instruction and consolation of the faithful, a fixture of convent life so constant it could become, God forgive us, almost invisible. But something in her that day was raw enough, or tired enough, or finally honest enough, that the image stopped being furniture and became a face. She saw what had been done to this Christ, and done for her. And she saw, with a clarity that came down on her like a weight she could not set aside, how little she had given back. Not a general, sentimental sorrow, a specific, personal accounting. This much love, poured out to the last stripe of blood, and my heart still divided, still bargaining, still keeping one hand on the world's door while I knelt in this room. The disproportion between what she had received and what she had returned broke over her all at once, and she could not stand under it. She fell to her knees before the statue, not gracefully, not composed, but the way a person falls when the legs simply will not hold anymore, and she wept. She begged Christ, there in the dim light of that borrowed image, to strengthen her once and for all, never to offend him again. It was not a resolution made in the cool part of the mind that makes resolutions and forgets them by supper. It came from somewhere much lower down, a place in her that had been quietly starving for years without her fully knowing it. She would later name this hour, without any exaggeration and with the plain honesty that marks all her writing about herself, as the turn of her whole life. Historians of her soul, and there have been many, going back to the confessors who sat with her in the months that followed, call it her second conversion, distinct from the vows she had made at 20, and infinitely more costly, because a vow made at 20 had been made with a heart that did not yet know what it was giving up. This vow, made kneeling before a wounded Christ at nearly 40, was made by a woman who understood exactly the cost of half measures, because she had spent 2 decades living inside them. She was not alone in this season, in finding herself broken open by an unlikely instrument. Not long before, or very near this same time, the record does not let us date it with perfect precision, and she herself telescopes the 2 graces together in her memory. A book had come into her hands that undid her nearly as thoroughly as the statue had. It was the Confessions of St. Augustine, newly translated, lent to her the way books were lent among religious houses, hand to hand, with no great ceremony attached. She had not expected it to matter to her. She began reading, and by the time she reached the account of the garden, the voice telling Augustine to take up and read, the long resistance finally breaking, the will surrendering after years of circling, she found she was not reading about a man who had died more than 1,000 years before. She was reading about herself. She said as much afterward, plainly. When she came to that garden, it seemed to her that the Lord had spoken those words for her. A soul divided against itself for years, dragging its feet toward a surrender it half wanted and half feared, watching another soul make that same crossing and finally, unmistakably, make it. There is nothing like it for showing a person the shape of her own hesitation. Augustine's garden and the Incarnation's oratory became, in her memory, 2 rooms of the same conversion. She wept over both. What is worth sitting with, before we go any further, is what did not happen after that day. Teresa did not wake the next morning perfectly recollected. She did not stop struggling with distraction, or with the pull of visits and conversation, or with the low creeping doubts that had shadowed her for years about whether the graces she was beginning to receive in prayer were even genuine. The struggle did not end. What ended was her willingness to bargain with it. Before the statue, she had been a woman trying to serve 2 masters and calling it prudence. After the statue, she was a woman still weak, still imperfect, still capable of being distracted by a visitor at the grill, but no longer divided at the root. The house had one owner now, even if the house was still being cleaned room by room, a labor that would occupy the rest of her life and never once feel finished to her. It is here, in the months that followed that broken hour, that she arrived, slowly, through trial and much interior argument with herself, at the understanding of prayer that would become her legacy to every soul who has ever picked up her writings, looking for a way into God. For years, she had approached mental prayer as a discipline to be endured. A spiritual exercise she was, by her own harsh estimation, failing to perform correctly. She had treated it, in other words, the way a person treats a technique, something with a right way and a wrong way, competence and incompetence, success measured in consolations felt or not felt. This was precisely the trap that had kept her circling for so long. Because a technique can be abandoned when it stops working, and she had very nearly abandoned it more than once, ashamed of her own dryness, certain that better souls than hers did not struggle the way she struggled. What broke open before the wounded Christ was not only her heart, but this whole mistaken frame. She came to see, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to make others see it as plainly as she now saw it. That mental prayer was never a performance to be judged competent or incompetent. It was a friendship to be entered, however badly, however haltingly, by a heart that showed up. She would write, years later, out of the fullness of this discovery, that mental prayer is nothing more nor less than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with the one we know loves us. Read those words quickly, and they sound almost too simple to be a spiritual doctrine at all. Sit with them, as she sat with them for the remainder of her life, and their strangeness starts to show. A friendship does not require eloquence. It does not require the absence of distraction, or dryness, or long stretches where nothing seems to be happening at all. Any two people who have loved each other faithfully for 20 years know exactly how much silence, how much simple sitting together without much being said, real friendship can hold. What a friendship requires is presence. Showing up, again, on the days when showing up feels like nothing at all. That was the door she had been failing to walk through for years, not because she lacked the aptitude for prayer, but because she had been standing in front of the wrong door entirely, looking for a technique to master when what was being offered her all along was a face to sit with. This is why the wounded Christ of that borrowed statue matters so much to everything that follows in her story, more perhaps than any single vision or voice she would later receive. Because what broke her heart in that oratory was not a doctrine about atonement, however true the doctrine. It was a face, wounded, specific, patiently waiting to be noticed by a woman who had walked past it 100 times without truly seeing it. She had spent years trying to love an idea of God correctly. What undid her was finally looking at a person. And once she had looked, really looked, she could no longer treat her hours of prayer as an exercise to be graded. She could only treat them as time spent with someone who had bled for her, and was still, after everything, waiting in that oratory for her to come back. There is a detail her early biographers loved to linger on, and it deserves a moment here too. This was, in a sense, a rehearsal for a wound that had not yet come. The heart that broke before a painted image of the scourged Christ would, years later and in the fullness of a very different kind of ministry, be pierced in truth, a fire, an angel, a pain so sweet she would not have traded it for anything the world could offer. That grace belongs to a later chapter of her life, and we will come to it in its own time and its own glory. But it is worth noting, standing here in this dim oratory with her, that the wound of love was not new to her even then. It had already been opening, slowly, for years, and this hour before the Cristo muy jogado was the moment the wound finally went all the way through. Everything that followed, the founding of houses, the long roads by mule cart, the raptures that would frighten her nearly as much as they consoled her, the writing that would one day earn her a place among the teachers of the Universal Church, grew out of the soil broken open in this one unremarkable room. She never spoke of that hour with any drama. If anything, she was almost apologetic about how long it had taken her to arrive at something so obvious, that God was not a judge to be placated with correctly performed exercises, but a friend who had been waiting, patiently, wounded and bleeding in a borrowed statue in an unused room, for her to finally sit down and look at him. She would spend the rest of her life trying to say this one thing to every soul who would listen. in letters, in constitutions for the houses she would found, in the great books that were still years away from being written. Prayer is not a ladder you climb by technique. It is a friendship you enter by showing up, imperfectly, again and again, before the face of the one who loved you first and never once stopped waiting in the room where you left him. She left the oratory that day, still the same woman in most outward respects, still under obedience at the Incarnation, still weak in the ways she had always been weak, still years from the reforms and foundations that would carry her name across Spain and then across the world. But something at the root had shifted, and it would not shift back. The long middle years, honest and difficult as they had been, were over. What came next was not ease, it was, finally, a beginning. The house on the Col de las Madres was small, poor, and, for the space of one August morning in 1562, completely illegal in the eyes of nearly everyone who mattered in Avila. Teresa knew it. She had spent 2 years building toward this morning in secret. And she had learned, in the building, exactly how much a woman past 40 could accomplish with a locked door, a trusted brother-in-law, and a stubbornness she no longer apologized for. The house had been bought under the name of her sister Juana's husband, Juan de Ovalle, so that no one in the city would guess its purpose until the walls were ready. Money had come quietly, much of it from a widowed friend named Guiomar de Ulia, whose fortune and whose faith in Teresa never seemed to run dry. A papal brief, obtained through patient correspondence, gave the project the one thing no amount of courage could substitute for: permission from Rome. On the morning of August 24th, the feast of St. Bartholomew, 4 young women received the habit of a reformed Carmel inside a chapel barely large enough to hold them, and Teresa of Jesus, not yet foundress of anything beyond this one small house, knelt among them and gave thanks that the thing had finally, actually happened. She did not yet know that by nightfall the entire city would be in an uproar over it. The trouble began almost as soon as the news spread past the garden wall. Avila was a city that took its convents seriously, and not entirely for spiritual reasons. The Convento de la Encarnación alone, Teresa's own house of profession, supported some 180 nuns on incomes and dowries the city's noble families had spent generations securing. A new convent meant, in the ledger book logic of the town council, one more house begging alms from a population that already had more mouths to feed than fields to feed them with. Within days, the council convened an emergency session. Preachers were found to denounce the new foundation from the pulpit. Someone circulated the idea that Teresa's convent, dedicated, at her insistence, to St. Joseph, and built on a rule of strict poverty with no fixed income at all, was not holiness but scandal, a woman's vanity dressed up as reform. The city fathers debated, with apparent seriousness, whether the house should simply be torn down. Teresa, who had slipped away from Avila to visit a sick friend on the very day the storm broke, returned to find herself the most argued-about woman in the city. She had by then learned something about waiting under fire that she would use for the rest of her life. She did not flinch in public, and she let her friends do the fighting she could not do herself from a cloister. Chief among them was a young Dominican theologian named Domingo Bañez, who examined her project, her doctrine, and her visions with the cold thoroughness of a man building a legal case, and who then stood up in front of the council and told them, in effect, that the woman they wished to silence was not a fraud, but a saint in the making, the harder verdict for a theologian to reach, and the one he reached anyway. The great hermit Pedro de Alcantara, whose word carried weight far beyond his rags, had already told her plainly that God was in this work, and that she should not abandon it for anyone's disapproval, hers least of all. Even so, the council's fury did not cool quickly. For a time it looked as though the 4 novices might be turned back into the street, and the house shuddered before it had drawn a full year's breath. It was Teresa's own provincial, worried about the scandal reaching his ears from Rome before he could control the story, who ordered her back to the Incarnation to answer for what she had done. She went. She always went when obedience asked it of her. This is a fact worth sitting with, for a woman modern readers are tempted to imagine as an unstoppable force of will. Teresa was unstoppable, but she was not disobedient. She returned to her old convent, resumed her place in choir among 300 women who had not been told the whole story and who were not shy about repeating what they had heard, and she waited, months of it, while the fate of the tiny house she had built with borrowed money and a brother-in-law's good name hung in the balance a few streets away. She was vindicated, in the end, not by argument, but by simple persistence. The council's fury burned itself out, as fury does when it has nothing new to feed on. The theological case, built stone by men like Banyas, held. And in December of that same year, with her provincial's blessing finally secured, Teresa was permitted to leave the Incarnation and take up residence at St. Joseph's herself, along with 4 more of the original novices. She was 50 years old. She had, at last, a house of her own making, 13 women, no fixed income, a rule of enclosure and silence and long hours of mental prayer that she had designed herself, drawing not on some invented severity, but on the original, primitive rule the Carmelite order had followed before centuries of papal dispensations had softened it into something gentler and, in Teresa's judgment, less alive. She called the little community her castle, though she would not write the book of that name for another 15 years. For now it was enough that the walls stood, that the door could be barred against the world's noise, and that inside it 13 women could give themselves entirely to the friendship with God she had spent a lifetime learning to practice. For 4 years, St. Joseph's was the whole of her project, and she might have been content, genuinely content, in the way she rarely used the word lightly, to spend the rest of her life inside those walls, praying and writing, and receiving the occasional visitor who had heard rumors of the strange, joyful holiness taking root behind them. It was the order itself that changed her course. In 1567, the Carmelite prior general, Father Juan Bautista Rubeo, a Roman, used to the grand and often lax observance of Italian houses, arrived in Spain to inspect his province and, almost as an afterthought, stopped in Avila to see the small reformed convent he had heard whispered about. What he found astonished him. He had expected, perhaps, an eccentric nun with a following. He found instead a rule kept with rigor and joy at once, a woman of formidable good sense running a household on nothing, and a peace in the place that Rubio, by his own account, had rarely encountered in more prosperous houses. He left Avila not merely satisfied but energized, and before he departed Spain he granted Teresa something she had not dared to ask for outright: patent letters authorizing her to found more houses of nuns under the same reform, and, more remarkably still, 2 houses of friars, men, willing to live under the same primitive austerity. That second permission was the harder gift to use. Teresa knew a great deal about running a convent of women. She knew almost nothing about recruiting men into a life most of the order's friars had spent generations comfortably escaping. She needed, urgently, at least one man of real prayer and real courage, willing to be the first stone of a reform among the friars, and for a long while she did not know where to find him. She found him, as it turned out, in Medina del Campo, in the person of a Carmelite student, barely 25 years old. So small in stature that Teresa would later joke, with the affection she reserved for people she had already decided to love, that he was scarcely half a friar in size, though whole in spirit. His name in religion was Fray Juan de Santo Matia. The world would come to know him as John of the Cross. He had already, before Teresa ever met him, considered leaving the Carmelites altogether for the stricter Carthusians, so hungry was he for a life of real silence and real prayer. When Teresa described to him instead a reform within his own order, the same rule she had built at St. Joseph's, but lived by men, she found in him not a recruit who needed convincing, but a soul who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to name the thing he already wanted. He agreed on the spot, with one condition of his own, that she not make him wait too long to begin. She did not make him wait long. Within months, she had found an older friar, Antonio de Heredia, prior of the Carmelite house in Medina, willing to join the project and lend it his seniority, and the 3 of them together went looking for a place to start. What they found in the tiny hamlet of Durello was less a house than a ruin, a farmhouse, half collapsed, that a nobleman named Rafael Mejia Velázquez had offered for the founding, apparently with more generosity than accuracy in describing its condition. Teresa went to see it herself before the friars moved in, riding out from Medina, in the kind of weather and over the kind of roads that would become, in the years ahead, the ordinary furniture of her life. What she found at Durello would have discouraged almost anyone else on site: a porch that could serve as a chapel if the ceiling were raised a little, a loft, a kitchen, and little else, no glass in most of the windows. Walls that let the Castilian wind through as if they were made of little more than intention. Teresa looked at it and wept, not, as she was careful to explain afterward, from dismay, but from something closer to delight. She had seen enough gilded, comfortable convents in her life to recognize what this ruin actually was. A return, at last, to the poverty the Carmelite rule had originally demanded and that centuries of soft accommodation had quietly buried. She called it, in her own writings, a little Bethlehem, a house too poor and too small for the world's notice, chosen for exactly that reason. When Fray John of the Cross and Fray Antonio moved in that Advent of 1568 to found the first house of discalced friars, they lowered the doorways themselves deliberately, so that no one could pass from one cramped cell of prayer to another without bowing the head and bending the body. A piece of architecture, Teresa understood at once, that was really a piece of theology. You could not walk through Durello standing tall. You entered it the way you were meant to enter the presence of God, low and willing to be low. From that single ruined farmhouse, the male branch of the Reform began to spread, just as the female branch had begun to spread from the one small house on the Cala das Madres. And from this point forward, for the better part of the next 15 years, Teresa's life took on a shape that no one who had known the sickly, cloistered girl of Avila could have predicted. She became a woman almost permanently in motion, crossing and recrossing the roads of Castile in creaking, unglazed mule carts, founding one house after another: Medina del Campo, Malagon, Valladolid, Toledo, Pastrana, Salamanca, and on, in weather that ranged from scorching to murderous, on roads that were sometimes barely roads at all, with a small community of nuns, a few trunks of linens and altar vessels, and whatever money had been scraped together for the next foundation, which was rarely enough. She did not travel like a woman romanticizing hardship, and her letters from these years make no effort to disguise how much the hardship actually cost her. Mule carts overturned, rivers flooded and had to be forded regardless. Inns along the way ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous, and more than once Teresa and her small band of nuns spent a night in conditions she described afterward, with the same dry humor she brought to nearly everything, noting, in one now famous complaint, that if this was how God treated his friends, it was no wonder he had so few of them. The line is often quoted as though it were a bitter joke. It was not bitter. It was the joke of a woman who loved God too completely to need him to make her comfortable, and who had decided long ago that the discomfort was simply the price of the work, paid cheerfully because the work itself was worth infinitely more than the price. What she was building, house by house, cart ride by cart ride, was never simply a chain of convents. It was a whole reformed way of living the Carmelite vocation, contemplative, poor, enclosed, saturated in mental prayer, restored to something closer to its founding fire, and handed on to men and women alike, who wanted, as she had wanted since girlhood, nothing less than friendship with God, practiced without distraction. The nuns who took the habit in these new foundations were, for the most part, drawn to exactly the severity that had so alarmed the city council of Avila back in 1562. No fixed income, small communities, long silences, a life built around prayer rather than around the social obligations that had cluttered the great unreformed convents. And beside her, however many miles separated them on any given month, stood the small friar from Fontiveros, who had bowed his head to walk through the low doorways of Durello, a partnership that would go on to shape not only the discalced Carmelite reform, but the whole future of Catholic mysticism, in ways neither of them could have measured on the day they first sat down together to plan it. Avila's council had once debated whether to tear her first house down. By the time Teresa was done, there would be houses of her reform scattered the length of Spain, each one carrying, in its low doorways and empty coffers, the same conviction that had gotten her nowhere, with the city fathers, and everywhere with God. That souls need silence and poverty and deep prayer the way bodies need bread, and that a woman with enough stubbornness and enough love could, against every reasonable objection, go about giving it to them. Sometime in 1562, at the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, a middle-aged nun sat at a small table with a stack of paper, a reed pen, and a headache that would not leave her alone for the rest of her life. She had been ordered to write, not encouraged, ordered. Her confessor, the Dominican Garcia de Toledo, wanted an account of her prayer, her visions, her whole interior life, set down on paper where learned men could examine it and decide whether God or the devil stood behind it. Teresa did not want to write it. She said so more than once in the very pages she was told to produce. She had convents to found, sisters to govern, a rule to defend, and now this, an old woman with cramped fingers and failing eyes, told to account for her own soul in ink. She did it anyway. She always did what obedience asked, even when obedience asked something absurd. And by the time she died in 1582, she had produced, almost by accident, one of the great bodies of spiritual literature the Church possesses. None of it was written for the world. All of it was written because someone in authority, a confessor, a superior, once even a whole committee of theologians, told her to write it. Or because her daughters, the nuns of her reform, needed something from her that she could not deliver in person from the back of a mule cart on some rutted road to Salamanca. The book Garcia de Toledo asked for became El Libro de la Vida, the book of her life. It is the account we have already drawn from in earlier chapters, the girl who ran off toward martyrdom, the years of tepid prayer she called her long, honest middle, the wounded Christ who broke her open at 40. But it was not written as memoir for its own sake. Teresa understood exactly what she was doing, laying her whole interior history bare for inspection. Because the alternative, silence, secrecy, a soul unexamined, was more dangerous to her than any embarrassment the confession might cause. She wrote knowing that learned men, letrados she trusted more than she trusted her own raptures, would read every page looking for the seams where a deceived woman might unknowingly reveal the devil's hand. She invited that scrutiny. She welcomed it, even when it terrified her. And it did terrify her, at times. Teresa had come of age in a Spain thick with suspicion of women who claimed to hear God speak. The Alumbrado scandals were recent memory. The Inquisition was not an abstraction, but a real tribunal with real power to silence, or worse, and a converse of family history like her own. Her grandfather had been reconciled by the Inquisition in Toledo. A fact the family never spoke of, but never fully escaped either, meant she had less margin for error than a nobleman's untroubled daughter might have enjoyed. She knew what was at stake in writing an account of ecstasies, locutions, and a heart she believed had been pierced by a seraph's flaming dart. So she did the only thing a prudent, faithful soul could do. She handed the whole of it over to men whose judgment she promised, again and again in her own words, to trust over her own certainty. If they told her something was illusion, she would believe them before she believed herself. That submission was not false modesty. It was the discipline of a woman who had watched too many souls go astray, trusting their own private fire, and who wanted, more than she wanted vindication, to be found faithful rather than famous, which makes what happened to the manuscript almost comic, in the way that so much of Teresa's life turns out to be comic if you know where to look. The life passed from confessor to confessor, was revised, expanded, and handed eventually to a Dominican theologian named Domingo Bañez for a final judgment. Bañez approved it. With reservations he noted in the margins, the sort of careful hedging a cautious scholar leaves when he believes a thing is holy but cannot quite say so without qualification. From there the manuscript found its way, through the tangled patronage of the Spanish nobility, into the hands of the Princess of Avila, a woman of considerable will and considerably less discretion, who read Teresa's most private confessions of divine favor and was scandalized rather than moved. When the princess later fell out with Teresa's reform, she had briefly entered one of the new convents herself, with predictably disruptive results. She denounced the book to the Inquisition out of spite. The manuscript was seized. It sat locked in an archive for years, unread by the very nuns it was meant, eventually, to comfort. Teresa did not live to see it published. It reached print in 1588, 6 years after her death, brought out by the Augustinian friar and poet Luis de Leon, who had never met her, but who called her, in his preface, one of the most extraordinary souls he had ever encountered on the page. The book that had been written to satisfy a suspicious churchman's demand for proof became, within a decade of her death, spiritual reading for half of Catholic Spain. Teresa's second major book carries none of that shadow, because she wrote it for people she already trusted completely, her own daughters. The Way of Perfection was composed around 1566 at the request of the nuns of St. Joseph's, who had asked her, quite simply, to teach them how to pray. Teresa had spent years learning mental prayer the hard way, through the long, dry season she describes so honestly in the life. through false starts and half measures, and the slow discovery that God wanted friendship, not performance. Now she had a small community of women depending on her to shorten that road for them, and she wrote like a mother who has no patience for anything that wastes her daughter's time. The book is startlingly direct. She takes the Our Father, a prayer every one of them had recited since childhood without necessarily praying it, and walks through it phrase by phrase, showing how an entire contemplative life can unfold from words most people say without thinking. She is blunt about convent friction, about gossip, about wounded feelings, about the small daily frictions of women living in close quarters under vows of poverty, and she has no patience for any of it. She wants her nuns free for prayer, and she tells them so with the particular bluntness of someone who has already lived through every excuse they are about to make. She is also, in this book more than anywhere else, very funny. Teresa's humor rarely announces itself with a joke. It surfaces sideways, in a parenthetical aside, an exasperated remark to God tucked into the margin of a serious point, a moment of self-mockery that catches the reader off guard. She apologizes constantly for her poor Latin, her poor style, her poor everything. "I don't know why you put up with me," she says to God more than once across her writings, in something closer to the tone of an old friend teasing another old friend than a penitent groveling before a judge. She complains, with visible relish, about her handwriting, about her headaches, about the sheer inconvenience of being asked to write theology when she would rather be scrubbing a convent floor. None of it reads as false humility. It reads as a woman who has made a kind of peace with her own limitations, who knows exactly what she has been given and exactly what she has not, and who finds the gap between the two more amusing than distressing. That confidence is the real key to understanding Teresa the author. She was obedient to the point of self-erasure. She wrote because she was told to, revised because she was told to, submitted every page to men whose formal education dwarfed her own, and yet underneath every apology sits a woman entirely sure of what she has been given to say. She never claims to be a theologian. She insists in nearly every prologue she ever wrote that she is an ignorant woman without letters, unqualified to teach anyone anything. And then she teaches, with a clarity and authority that made even her most cautious examiners set down their pens in something like awe. The self-deprecation and the certainty are not in tension in Teresa. They are the same gift, worn two different ways. She was humble about her learning and absolutely fearless about her experience because she knew the difference between the two, and she trusted the second even while she disclaimed the first. Her third great book grew directly out of the years of travel we have already followed: the convent, the cart, the reform stretching across Castile. The Book of Foundations is Teresa's chronicle of the houses she established, begun in 1573 and added to almost continuously until near her death, a working record kept the way a tired administrator keeps minutes. Except that the administrator in question cannot help turning every entry into a small, vivid scene. Here are the muddy roads, the innkeepers who cheated her, the bishops who blocked her, and the ones who wept with joy at her arrival. The sisters who nearly starved in Medina del Campo before the first gift of bread appeared at the door, the property deals gone wrong, the lawsuits, the endless negotiations with fathers and uncles and municipal councils, who all had opinions about whether Spain needed one more convent of barefoot nuns. It is the least polished of her books and, in some ways, the most companionable. A diary written by a foundress too busy to be literary, which makes its moments of literary brilliance land all the harder. She had already told God, flat on the ground after one particularly humiliating fall from a cart, exactly what she thought of how he treated his friends. The Foundations is full of that same spirit. Exhausted, wry, utterly undefeated. None of this came without a price, and the price was paid in her body. Teresa wrote at night, after full days spent negotiating with lawyers or bishops or reluctant patrons, after hours on the road that left her joints aching and her stomach in the state of near-constant complaint that had plagued her since her 20s. Her handwriting in the surviving manuscripts grows visibly worse across the years, cramped, hurried, occasionally trailing into near illegibility where exhaustion or failing eyesight overtook her mid-sentence. She wrote letters by the hundreds, often several a day, to superiors and benefactors and her own scattered daughters in convents she could not visit as often as she wished. The surviving correspondence alone would fill volumes, dashed off between founding one house and setting out for the next, full of practical instruction, financial worry, spiritual counsel, and again, that same undefeated humor, even when the news in the letter was bad. Writing for Teresa was never a retreat from the active life of the Reform. It was one more labor layered on top of an already impossible schedule, undertaken at the direct cost of the rest her body badly needed and rarely got. And still she kept submitting every page to judgment. That habit of discernment never relaxed, no matter how many books she completed or how firmly her confessors came to trust her. Every new locution, every fresh experience of God's presence in prayer, went first to whichever theologian currently held her confidence, to be turned over, questioned, and weighed against the teaching of the Church before Teresa herself would rest easy calling it authentic. She lived, in other words, exactly as she had always lived, sure of her friendship with God and suspicious of her own capacity to be wrong about it, holding both at once without either canceling the other out. By the mid-1570s, her daughters, scattered across a dozen new foundations, had absorbed everything she had given them in the way of perfection and the life, and still they wrote to her asking for more, for some way to understand what actually happens to a soul as it moves deeper into prayer, stage by stage, toward the God who waits at the center of it. Teresa had an image already forming, one that had come to her, she said, almost complete, a soul like a castle made entirely of crystal, with many rooms leading inward toward a single chamber where the king himself was waiting. She would not begin writing it down for a few years yet. When she finally did, in 1577, obedience and her own certainty would meet one more time in the book that would become the crown of everything she had written before it, and that story belongs to the chapter ahead. In the summer of 1577, in a cramped cell of the Toledo Carmel, Teresa picked up her pen for what she assumed would be a small penance, and produced, instead, the summit of her teaching. Her confessor and superior, Padre Geronimo Gracian, had ordered her to write once more about prayer. Not because the world lacked books on the subject, she protested, but because he wished it, and obedience did not require her opinion, only her hand. She was 62. Her health was a ruin of fevers and fainting, and the old heart trouble that had never left her since Besatus. She told him plainly that she did not know what more she could say, that she had not already said in the life and the way of perfection. And then, sitting with the blank page in front of her on Trinity Sunday, she was given an image she had not gone looking for, the way the best of her graces always arrived, not summoned, but sent. She saw the soul as a castle made entirely of one diamond, or a very clear crystal, in which there were many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions. And at the very center of that castle, in the innermost room, sat the king, brilliant beyond telling, filling every corner of the structure with his light, even when the soul at its outer edge could not yet see it. This was not decoration. This was the truest thing Teresa knew about the human person, that the soul is not a small, shabby thing to be tolerated until death releases it into something better, but a dwelling of such dignity that God himself has made his home inside it. And the whole labor of a life is nothing other than finding the way to the room where he waits. She called the book Las Moradas, the Mansions, though the world has come to know it by the title that says the same thing more simply, The Interior Castle. She wrote it in a matter of months in wretched health, and sent it off to be read by Father Gracian and by the theologian Diego de Yepes, with the same mixture of confidence and self-deprecation that marks everything she ever wrote for her daughters. She did not think she was composing a masterpiece. She thought she was obeying an order and passing along, as clearly as she could, what 40 years of mental prayer had taught her about the soul's traffic with God. The Church has since named it, alongside the life, among the chief reasons she stands among the doctors of the Church. But Teresa herself would have been the first to say that the honor belongs to the castle's real architect, not its scribe. The castle has 7 mansions, and the movement through them is the whole of a life given to prayer, from its first trembling steps to its final rest. It is worth walking through slowly, because nothing Teresa ever wrote repays haste less. The outer mansions, the first, are not far inside the wall at all. Souls here are in a state of grace, They possess the castle by right, as every baptized soul does, but they linger near the entrance, distracted, and the courtyard just outside is full of what Teresa calls, without a trace of squeamishness, reptiles and vermin, the ordinary sins and attachments and vanities of the world that creep in through the gate and make it hard for the soul even to notice the light coming from the center. Souls at this stage pray, but only fitfully, and they know remarkably little about themselves. Self-knowledge, Teresa insists, is the foundation of everything that follows. A soul that does not know its own poverty will never recognize the riches waiting deeper in. The second mansions belong to souls who have begun to hear the call more clearly. Through a sermon, a good book, an illness, a grief, and who start to practice prayer in earnest, though the noise of the courtyard still follows them in. This is the mansion of struggle without much consolation, the plain grinding work of turning back toward God again and again after being pulled away, and Teresa treats it with enormous tenderness because she remembered it in her own bones. The third mansions are further in still. Souls here are ordered, disciplined, careful about sin, generous in penance and almsgiving, good souls by any honest measure. And yet Teresa will not let them, or her reader, rest easy here. Because a soul can grow so attached to its own good order that it forgets it is dealing with God at all, rather than with a private project of self-improvement. These souls still rely almost entirely on their own effort. They have not yet learned, as she puts it, that the real work from this point forward is not something they do, but something they let be done to them. It is at the fourth mansions that everything changes, and Teresa marks the change with one of the loveliest images she ever set on paper. 2 ways of filling a garden's water basin. In the first, water is hauled by hand, bucket after bucket, up from a well far off, by means of an aqueduct and considerable labor. This is the prayer of effort, of meditation, of the mind working hard to think its way toward God. In the second, the basin fills itself, quietly, because a spring rises directly beneath it and needs no one's arms to carry the water anywhere. This is what she calls the prayer of quiet, and it is the hinge on which the whole castle turns. The point where the soul's own striving gives way to something given rather than achieved, where God begins, gently and almost imperceptibly, to do the greater share of the praying himself. Teresa is careful here, as she always is, not to let her daughters think this quiet is something to chase or manufacture. It comes when it comes. The soul's task is only to stop hauling buckets long enough to notice the spring is already flowing. The fifth mansions bring the famous image of the silkworm, which Teresa loved enough to return to more than once in her writing. The worm feeds on the mulberry leaf, on ordinary practices, sacraments, the plain diet of a Christian life, until it is ready to spin itself a cocoon and, apparently, to die inside it. And then, from that little grave, a white butterfly emerges, and the worm that built the cocoon no longer exists in any form the worm would recognize. This is the prayer of union, the soul's faculties suspended, briefly but genuinely, in a communion with God so complete that for a time nothing else can get in, not memory, not imagination, not even the noise of the soul's own thoughts. Teresa is scrupulously honest that these unions do not last. The butterfly once formed must still fly about in a world full of danger, and the soul that has tasted union in prayer returns from it to a life of ordinary work, ordinary temptation, ordinary Tuesdays, but it returns changed, restless for the one it briefly held, and unable to settle again for less. That restlessness deepens and turns to something like suffering. In the sixth mansions, the longest section of the book, because it is the strangest country the soul travels through. Here come the raptures Teresa knew so well from her own decades of prayer. The sense of being lifted bodily out of oneself, the interior locutions in which words arrive that are not one's own thought, and yet are heard as clearly as speech, the visions that come not through the eyes, but through some deeper faculty entirely. It was in a mansion very like this one that Teresa had felt, years before at the Incarnation. The seraph's dart pierce her heart in the transverberation, the wound that Bernini would one day carve in marble, the wound she carried, she said, for years afterward, sweet and unbearable at once. She places that grace here deliberately, among the sixth mansion's account of the soul's deepest wounding by love, because this stage of the journey is defined by exactly that paradox, greater favors and greater trials arriving together. inseparably. The soul stretched almost past bearing by how much it now loves and how far it still knows itself to be from the one it loves. This is the mansion of betrothal. Teresa uses the word deliberately, borrowing the language of engagement, because the soul here has been asked, in effect, and has said yes, but the wedding has not yet taken place. There is still a distance, however slight, between the soul and God, and the ache of that remaining distance is sharper now than any suffering that came before it, precisely because the soul has been given so clear a taste of what full union would feel like. And then, at the center, the seventh mansions, the innermost room where the king has been sitting all along, waiting through every chapter of the book for the soul to finally arrive, comes the spiritual marriage. Teresa is at pains to distinguish this from everything that came before it, even from the raptures of the sixth mansion, because here there is no more coming and going, no more ecstasy that lifts the soul out of itself and then sets it down again, changed but separate. Here the union is settled, permanent, a marriage rather than a courtship. Teresa reaches for the plainest images she can find to describe something that resists description entirely. Two candles whose flames have become one flame, so that no one could say any longer where the first ends and the second begins. Rain falling into a river until the two waters are indistinguishable. A room with two windows through which a single light pours, so that from a certain distance it looks like one light rather than two. The soul does not stop being itself, it does not dissolve or disappear, but it no longer experiences God as a separate presence to be visited in prayer and left behind when prayer ends. He is simply there, now, at the center of everything, the way the sea is there beneath a ship, whether or not the sailors happen to be looking at the water. And here Teresa does something that has startled and delighted her readers for 400 years. Having led the soul all the way to the innermost chamber of the castle, to the highest union a creature can have with its creator on this side of heaven, she does not conclude that the point of it all is to stay there, wrapped in bliss forever. She says the opposite. The whole purpose of the spiritual marriage, she insists, is fruitfulness, Martha and Mary, finally reconciled in one soul, so that the woman who has been given the deepest contemplative union of her life rises from that union and goes, without resentment, to serve the sick, to found the next house, to mend the linen, to answer the door. The end of prayer, she wrote elsewhere, in words the interior castle only confirms, is always good works. A soul that comes back from the innermost room and cannot be bothered with the kitchen has not understood the castle at all. Teresa built 7 convents and reformed an order after her transverbration, not despite it. The 7th mansion does not excuse a soul from Tuesday. It makes Tuesday finally bearable, even lovely, because now it is done in company. It is worth saying plainly, because the book's grandeur can obscure it. None of this was ever meant for a rarefied few. Teresa wrote the interior castle for ordinary nuns in ordinary convents, women scrubbing floors and nursing fevers and quarreling gently over the wash, and she meant every one of them to understand that the castle she described was not a special province reserved for great mystics, but the plain architecture of every baptized soul. Some souls will be given raptures and locutions along the way, most will not, and Teresa is careful to say that the graces of the 6th mansion are not the measure of holiness. The 7th mansion's quiet, settled union with God's will, expressed in humility and service, matters far more than any vision ever will. The castle is not a ladder for the spiritually ambitious to climb past one another. It is a map of what happens, slowly and by grace, to anyone who keeps walking inward and does not turn back. That is why it makes such sense that the words for which Teresa is best remembered outside her books are not found in any chapter of the castle at all. After her death, in her breviary, her sisters found a small bookmark in her own hand with 4 lines of Spanish verse that have traveled further than almost anything else she wrote. Nada te turbe, nada te espante. Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. Todo se pasa, all things are passing. Dios no se muda, God never changes. La paciencia todo lo alcanza, patience obtains all things. Quien a Dios tiene nada le falta, whoever has God lacks nothing. Solo Dios basta, God alone suffices. It is not a mystical teaching in the technical sense. It carries no talk of mansions or raptures or spiritual marriage. It is the voice of the same woman who once told her sisters that God walks among the pots and pans, distilled down to its plainest, hardest, most practical courage. The voice a foundress used on a mule cart in a flood. The voice a girl used walking out the city gate toward the moors. The voice of a nun facing down a suppressed foundation with nothing but a breviary and her own stubborn trust. It is the whole castle, folded small enough to carry in a pocket. Whatever room a soul finds itself in on a given day, courtyard or quiet or dark night or the innermost chamber itself, the instruction does not change. Let nothing disturb you. Patience obtains all things. God alone suffices. Teresa spent a lifetime building the mansions so her daughters would have somewhere to walk. She left them this so they would have something to hold on to on the way. The last journey did not look like triumph. In the late summer of 1582, Teresa was 67 years old, racked with the ailments that had followed her for a lifetime. The fevers, the fainting, the ruined stomach, the heart that had never fully recovered from whatever wound 30 years of grace had left in it. She was traveling by cart and by mule from Burgos, where she had just finished founding her last house, toward Alba de Tormes, at the summons of the Duchess of Alba, who wanted her present for the birth of a grandchild. Teresa did not want to go. She wanted, by every account her daughters left behind, to go home to Avila, to the convent of San Jose where the reform had begun, to end her days among the sisters who had known her longest. She went to Alba instead, because she had said yes to a request, the way she had said yes to so many requests across 30 years of roads. Obedience did not stop asking things of her, simply because her body had nothing left to give. The journey was brutal. She arrived at Alba de Tormes on the 20th of September, already dying, though no one around her wanted to use that word yet. Anna de San Bartolome, the laywoman who had become her closest companion and nurse in these final years, was with her. And it is to Anna's testimony, along with the memories of the Alba community, that the tradition owes its account of these last 2 weeks. Teresa took to her bed. She could keep almost nothing down. And still, astonishingly, she asked to see the community's account books, to make sure the convent's debts were settled and nothing was owed. The foundress who had spent her life negotiating with landlords and bishops over the price of houses was still negotiating, from her deathbed over the price of candles. On the 3rd of October, she received viaticum, the Eucharist given to the dying, and the sisters who witnessed it said her whole face changed, that some great joy broke over her at the sight of the host, as though after a lifetime of desiring union with Christ she could see at last that the waiting was nearly finished. She said, according to the testimony gathered afterward, "O my Lord and my spouse, the desired hour has now come. It is time that we see each other, my beloved." It was the last long sentence anyone recorded from her. What followed was quieter. She asked forgiveness of the community for her failures as their mother. She blessed those around her, and through the 4th of October she declined, murmuring psalms, holding a crucifix, while the sisters knelt around the bed and wept. She died that night. The exact hour matters less than what the calendar was doing around it. Pope Gregory XIII had decreed, that same year, the great correction to the Julian calendar that had drifted out of alignment with the seasons over centuries, and the correction fell precisely then, so that the night Teresa died, the 4th of October, simply became the 15th. 10 days vanished from the world's reckoning between one sunset and the next. Teresa of Jesus, who had spent her whole religious life insisting that eternity presses in against ordinary time, that the soul at prayer stands closer to God than the clock admits, died on a night when the calendar itself buckled and skipped forward. The Carmelite tradition has never let go of that coincidence, and it does not ask the reader to either. Her feast is kept on the 15th of October, the date the world woke up to the morning after she died, and it has felt ever since like more than accident. The community at Alba buried her in the convent chapel, wrapped simply in the poor coffin she would have wanted. And there the story might have rested, a beloved foundress laid to rest in one of her own houses, mourned by the daughters she had gathered, except that 9 months later, when the grave was opened, to move her body to a more suitable resting place, the wood of the coffin had rotted through with damp, her religious habit had begun to disintegrate against her skin, and Teresa herself had not decayed at all. Her body was found whole, supple, fragrant, with an odor the sisters could not account for by any natural means. Word of it spread through Carmelite houses and beyond them with the speed such things always travel, and it did not stop spreading for 400 years. What happened next is not entirely to the Church's credit, and the tradition does not pretend otherwise. Avila wanted her body back. She belonged, by every claim of history and affection, to the city of her birth and to San Jose, the first house of the Reform. Alba de Tormes, where she had died and where the Duchess held considerable sway, was determined to keep what it now understood it possessed. The dispute dragged through ecclesiastical and even civil channels for years, and it produced, along the way, one of the stranger chapters in the story of her relics. Her body was in fact secretly removed to Avila in 1586, kept there for months amid considerable controversy, before Rome intervened and ordered it returned to Alba de Tormes, where it has remained ever since, enshrined beneath the high altar of the convent church. In the process of all this moving and opening and examining, portions of her body were separated as relics in their own right, most famously her heart, still bearing, the Carmelite tradition holds, the visible mark of the wound left by the transverberation, the flaming dart that pierced her decades before in Avila. That heart is venerated to this day in a reliquary at Alba de Tormes, and pilgrims who make the journey there can still see it. Her left hand went eventually to a discalced community. Other relics of hers were distributed over the centuries among houses of the order she founded, each fragment carrying forward, in Carmelite belief, something of the fire that had filled the whole woman. None of this would have moved the Church to formal recognition on its own. Incorrupt bodies and cherished relics are, in Catholic history, more common than the casual reader might expect, and holiness is not proven by the state of a corpse. What moved Rome across the decades that followed Teresa's death was testimony, hundreds of witnesses across Spain who had known her, been directed by her, been healed through her intercession, or simply changed by an encounter with her, all giving sworn statements to church investigators about a life that looked, examined closely and skeptically, like sanctity. The process that the Church calls canonization is slow by design, built to resist the pull of enthusiasm and grief, and Teresa's cause moved through it methodically, beatified in 1614 by Pope Paul V, 32 years after her death, and canonized on the 12th of March, 1622, by Pope Gregory XV, the same year, remarkably, that saw the canonization of Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, and Philip Neri, a quartet of Spanish and Italian reformers raised to the altars together, as though the Church wanted to say something about the whole extraordinary generation that had renewed it from within. Teresa was declared a saint of the Universal Church less than half a century after she had been, in the eyes of some of her own contemporaries, a suspect woman writing suspect books. The title of Doctor of the Church was a longer road still, and it asked something the Church had never granted a woman before. The honor recognizes a saint's writings as bearing universal authority for the instruction of the faithful, not merely edifying, not merely historically important, but teaching with the kind of doctrinal reliability that the whole Church can build on. For nearly 3.5 centuries after Teresa's death, that title had gone only to men, many of them bishops and theologians trained in the schools she herself had never attended. She had written, by her own repeated insistence, only because her confessors ordered her to, only in whatever hours the convent's business left free, only in the plain Castilian of a woman with no Latin. And it was precisely that unschooled directness her critics had once suspected that disqualified her from being taken as seriously as the university-trained doctors of the faith. The Second Vatican Council changed the atmosphere in which that question could even be asked. In its call for the whole Church, laity included, to take up the deep life of prayer, the Council's own documents leaned again and again on categories Teresa had given the Church 400 years before, the distinction between vocal and interior prayer, the insistence that contemplation was not a luxury for cloistered specialists, but the birthright of every baptized soul. Theologians and bishops petitioning Rome in the years after the Council made the case plainly. If the Church was going to ask its people to pray as she had taught, it should say so formally, by naming her among its teachers. Pope Paul VI agreed. On the 27th of September, 1970, in St. Peter's Basilica, he proclaimed Teresa of Jesus a doctor of the Church, the first woman in the Church's 2,000-year history to receive the title, named on the same day as Catherine of Siena, so that the honor, when it finally came to 2 women together, as though Rome wanted the record to show it had not merely made an exception, but recognized a pattern too long ignored. Paul VI's own words framed her authority plainly. Her teaching, tested and confirmed by centuries of use in the whole church, was fit to instruct not only cloistered nuns, but bishops, theologians, and every praying soul in the pews. It is worth sitting with what that declaration actually says, because the honor is easy to hear as a kind of retroactive medal and miss its real weight. To name Teresa a doctor of the church is not to say she was clever, or that her books are beautiful, though both are true. It is to say that when the whole church needs to be taught how to pray, it can open the interior castle or the way of perfection and be taught reliably, the way it can open the writings of Augustine or Aquinas. It is to say that the woman the Inquisition once eyed with suspicion, whose confessors sometimes doubted whether her visions were angels or demons, whose own prioress locked her books away for a season out of caution, that woman's plain Castilian prose now stands in the Church's own judgment alongside its greatest formal theology, not despite its plainness, but because of the fire the plainness carries. Bernini had already sculpted that fire in marble. A century before Paul VI's declaration, the arrow suspended forever an inch from her heart in the Cornaro Chapel in Rome. The Church's own theological language finally caught up to what the marble had already understood. None of this, the tradition insists, put Teresa at any distance from ordinary believers. If anything, it drew her closer. Her feast day on the 15th of October is kept now in discalced Carmelite houses on every continent and in countless parishes that have no direct link to her order at all. A day when the readings turn, inevitably, to prayer as friendship with God. The definition she gave, that has outlived every more technical one theology has offered since. Pilgrims still travel to Avila to walk the streets where she was born, to stand in the room believed to be the one where she was born in the family house on the Cala de la Dama, to pray in San Jose, the first house of her reform, and to visit the museum built into the old convent that holds her relics, a finger, a sandal, the walking stick that steadied her on the endless roads of her foundations. Pilgrims traveled just as often to Alba de Tormes, to kneel before the reliquary that holds her heart and to stand where her body itself still rests, incorrupt in the tradition's unwavering witness across 4 centuries, though the Church has never made the physical state of her body the ground of her sainthood. That ground was always the life, examined honestly, that produced it. What keeps her closest to ordinary readers, though, has nothing to do with relics at all. It is the readers themselves, the retired teacher who picks up the interior castle because a friend mentioned it, the seminarian assigned the way of perfection, who expected dry spiritual theology, and instead met a woman making jokes about bad confessors, the parent exhausted at the end of a day, who reads 3 pages of Teresa before sleep and feels not instructed exactly, but accompanied. The tradition has a particular way of describing what happens across 4 centuries of such readers. It says she is still founding, not founding buildings any longer. 32 houses were enough for one lifetime, and the last of them was finished before she ever reached Alba de Tormes. She is founding, the Carmelite family likes to say, in every soul that opens her books and decides, on her word, to try mental prayer for the first time. In every discalced community still living the primitive rule she recovered. In every reader anywhere who has never worn a habit and never will, but who has learned from her, as directly as her own daughters learned it, that God can be spoken to as a friend and found, if the soul is willing to be still long enough, at the center of a castle it was carrying the whole time. She wanted, at the very end, only to go home to Avila. She never got there in the ordinary sense. She is buried still at Alba de Tormes, in the convent that was not the one she loved best, having said yes one final time to a summons she would rather have refused. But the tradition has come to see in that last refusal something entirely in keeping with the woman who lived it. Obedience carrying her past her own preference to the very last mile. Love outlasting comfort to the very last breath. And a body that, having given everything it had to a fire lit 50 years before in a convent parlor in Avila, simply refused afterward to go the way of ordinary things. In Avila, the door of the Encarnacion is heavy oak, black with age, iron-studded, closed every night by a portress with a ring of keys the size of a child's fist. Teresa passed through that door thousands of times, as a girl of 20 entering with her father's blessing still ringing false in her ears, as a prioress of 47 slipping out before dawn to found a house in Medina, as an old woman half dead on a mule cart being carried home to die. It never once occurred to her that a door built for God's work should stay shut against the world. She spent her whole life propping doors open, convent grills, confessional windows, the sealed rooms of her own soul, so that more air, more light, more of him could get in. This book has been a door too, a small one, low enough to duck through, wide enough to let you glimpse the rooms beyond. You have stood in the plaza at Avila and heard a child threaten to walk to Morocco for martyrdom. You have sat with a prioress, copying letters by candlelight, her hand cramped, her patience longer than the night. You have watched a woman kneel before a battered statue of the scourged Christ, and finally, after 18 years of trying and failing and trying again, let herself be loved. You have ridden the cart roads of Castile in winter mud, argued with bishops, laughed at a nun who could not carry a tune, and stood at the threshold of a castle made of crystal, where the king himself waits in the innermost room. You have seen a body that would not decay, and a fire that 4 centuries have not managed to put out. That is a full life for a small book to hold, and it is not, I promise you, the whole of her. Everything in these 9 chapters is true, and everything in these 9 chapters is a doorway rather than a destination. I have given you the shape of Teresa the way you might give someone the shape of a person you love in a single evening's conversation. The stories that matter most, the moments that explain everything else, the humor and the wounds and the plain hard facts of a life spent mostly on the road or on her knees. But a friendship built in one evening is only the beginning of a friendship. If you have felt, anywhere in these pages, that quickening of recognition, that sense that this woman is not a statue in a niche, but a person you would like to know better, then the invitation of this book's title has already done its work. The 3 volumes of her full life are waiting on the other side of that door, and I want to tell you plainly what each one holds, because you deserve to know what you are walking toward. The first volume is called A Heart on Fire, A Heart Divided, and it takes you back to Gotarandura and the Cepeda household with a patience this short book could not afford. You have met her father Alonso and her mother Beatrice here, only in glimpses. A stern, honorable, debt-anxious man, a mother who loved chivalric romances and died too young. In the full volume, you will sit at their table longer. You will meet her brother Rodrigo properly, the partner in that famous foiled bid for martyrdom, and you will follow him all the way to his death in South America, a lost Teresa carried quietly for the rest of her life. You will see the convent school at Santa Maria de Gracia, where a grieving, motherless teenager first tasted the rhythm of religious life and did not at first want it. You will read her own account, in her words as she herself set them down, of the fear and vanity and half-heartedness that nearly kept her from ever taking the veil at all, and then of the 20 years inside the incarnation that this book could only summarize as the long, honest middle. That middle deserves its full length. It is the part of her story most readers need most, because it is the part that looks like their own prayer life, distracted, guilty, half-committed, circling the same failures, decade after decade. The full volume does not rush past that suffering to get to the miracles. It sits with her in it, through the paralysis that left her nearly dead at 23, through the years of scarcely being able to pray at all, through the confessors who misunderstood her, and the ones who finally didn't, until you arrive, having earned it alongside her, at the same statue of the wounded Christ that broke her open in this book's 4th chapter. There you will find the conversion of 1554, rendered in its full weight, not as a single dramatic turn, but as the hinge on which 40 years of struggle finally swings free. This is the volume for anyone who has ever felt like a failure at prayer and needs to know that one of the Church's greatest mystics felt exactly the same way for 2 decades before anything changed. The second volume is The Roads of Castile, and it is the one I suspect will surprise you most, because it is the funniest. This is Teresa the foundress in full stride, not the single convent and single cart glimpsed in this book's 5th chapter, but the entire campaign, 17 foundations across Castile and Andalusia, made in old age, in poor health, in winter, with almost no money, and a great deal of opposition from bishops, mayors, and her own order. You will read about the founding of Medina del Campo, in a house so run down, the first night's mass had to be said behind a curtain, because there was no proper altar. You will follow her to Toledo, to Salamanca, to Seville, where the summer heat nearly killed her, and a lawsuit over a house's ownership dragged on for months. You will meet the men who share this volume's stage with her. San Juan de la Cruz, tiny and luminous, whom she recruited to bring the reform to the friars, and who suffered imprisonment and worse for it. The difficult, brilliant, occasionally maddening collaborators and rivals within her own Carmelite family. This is where the primitive rule stops being an idea and becomes brick and mortar, where you see exactly what it costs to insist that Carmelite life return to poverty, silence, and enclosure against the wishes of people with real power to stop her. And because Teresa wrote her Book of Foundations precisely to record this campaign in her own voice, the volume can quote her directly at every turn, her wry asides about difficult landladies, her exasperation with lawyers, her tenderness toward the poorest of her daughters. This is also the volume of The Way of Perfection, written for her nuns at San Jose, and treated here at the length it deserves, not as a manual, but as one woman's fierce, funny, practical love letter to the sisters she was forming, full of advice on humility and detachment that reads, 450 years later, like it was written yesterday for you. If this book's 6th chapter on writing for her daughters left you wanting more of that voice, plain-spoken, self-deprecating, utterly without pretense, this is where you will find it in abundance. The 3rd volume is the 7th mansion, and it is the summit toward which the whole life climbs. Here the mystical graces this book could only gesture at, the raptures, the interior locutions, and above all the transverberation, that piercing of her heart by the seraph's flaming dart, which Bernini would later carve in marble for the whole world to kneel before, are given the space to be understood rather than merely reported. You will learn what these experiences meant to Teresa herself, how she tested them against Scripture and the counsel of her confessors, how wary she was of anyone who prized ecstasy over obedience and ordinary charity. And you will watch the interior castle, glimpsed here in this book's 7th chapter, as a floor plan, a lovely diagram of 7 mansions, open fully into the masterwork it actually is, written in a matter of weeks in 1577, under obedience, while she suffered from the worst headaches of her life, and yet somehow the clearest map ever drawn of the soul's journey inward to the place where God dwells. The full volume walks every room with you. It shows you what she says about the reptiles and vermin that crowd the outer mansions of a soul still attached to sin, about the strange peace of the 4th mansion where prayer stops being work and starts being gift, about the spiritual marriage of the 7th mansion where the soul and God are so united that, as she puts it, they are like rain falling into a river, no longer separable. This volume also carries her to the end, the failing body of her last years, the final foundation at Burgos undertaken when she could barely sit a mule, the last journey to Alba de Tormes, and the death this book's 8th chapter described only in outline. And it carries her legacy forward too. The incorrupt body, the 4th-century pilgrimage to her tomb, the canonization in 1622, and the moment in 1970 when Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman ever to receive that honor, confirming in Rome what her daughters and her readers had always known in their bones, that she speaks from within the fire itself, and that the whole Church may safely warm its hands at it. 3 volumes, then. One for the fire and the long division that nearly quenched it. One for the roads, the carts, the convents built with her own bruised hands. One for the summit and the flame that still burns. Together they are not a longer version of this book, they are the country this book has only shown you from its border. I have tried in these 9 chapters to be honest rather than merely admiring, to let you see her temper as well as her tenderness, her years of dryness as well as her raptures, her sharp tongue with lazy confessors as well as her patience with frightened novices. That honesty is not a caveat to the reverence, it is the reverence. We do not love saints well by sanding down their edges. Teresa would have found that kind of devotion, frankly, a little insulting. She wanted to be known, warts and headaches and all, because she believed, rightly, that a God who could work in a woman that flawed and that fierce is a God worth trusting with your own flawed, fierce life. That is, in the end, the whole of her invitation, and it has never been complicated. Come and pray, she says, not perfectly, not with your distractions solved or your doubts resolved. Just come, the way she came, again and again for 40 years before it felt like anything at all. She is not asking you to become a mystic. She is asking you to become a friend of God, the way she describes it plainly in her own writings on mental prayer. Nothing more than taking time, frequently, to be alone with one who you know loves you. The castle is already inside you. The door has never once been locked from his side. So let me leave you not with a summary. This book has already resisted enough of those, but with a blessing, because that is what she would want and because it is what she left behind for exactly this purpose. In the small breviary found among her things after her death at Alba de Tormes, tucked in like a bookmark, was a handwritten verse that has traveled the world since in 100 languages, prayed by popes and schoolchildren, and I hope now by you. Nada te turbe, nada te spante. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. Everything passes. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Let that be the last word this book gives you, because it was very nearly the last word she gave the world. Go on now and open the next door. She has been holding it for you the whole time.